All right, welcome everyone. My name is Jason Oliver Chang. I am Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies here at the University of Connecticut. And I'm also Director of the Asian and Asian American Studies Institute. So you all are attending the first What is Critical Muslim Studies program. Welcome. This is great. I'm so excited for today. I want to begin by recognizing that we are on indigenous land, the Wengung, Tungsis, and Sikyog peoples, and that we honor their struggles for survival. Even though they are not federally recognized tribes, we uphold their legacy of care for this place that we live in together. Our first guest for this series is Professor Nasim Basiri, Visiting Assistant Professor, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. Professor Basiri is an Iranian poet, researcher, and currently in this position here in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. She's lived, worked, and studied transnationally in South Asia, Europe, Middle East, and North America since the age of 20. Nasim's poetry has been featured in several journals, including in international poetry festivals and global anthologies, including International Gallerie, Living Encounters, Revista, Diaspora, Oriente, Medio, Norte de Africa, north of Oxford, and Oregon's Best Emerging Poets 2019 Anthology by Z Publishing House, among other publications. Some of her research interests are social and political movements in the Middle East, history of gender violence in contemporary Iran, gender and genocide, feminist literature and cinema, transnational feminisms, and feminist pedagogy. We are so lucky to have you here with us, Professor Basiri. She is joined by 3 student discussants from UConn Hartford, Khadija Sana, Sharah, Ahmed, and Farah, Mahmoud. Welcome, y'all. Khadija is a second-year student at UConn, comes from a Muslim Pakistani background, is undecided in her major, but is considering accounting. Sharah is a first-gen Muslim Bengali student in her second year at UConn, also planning on majoring in business data analytics. And Farah, I would love for you to introduce yourself briefly.
Okay, all right. I'm a second year at UConn Hartford in Hartford, and I'm doing pre-dentistry, and I'm also doing business data analysis.
Oh,
and
wonderful.
I'm Egyptian.
Egyptian. Beautiful. So the purpose of this series is to introduce different perspectives on the intellectual, scholarly, political, and cultural project of critical Muslim studies. It's a field that gained momentum during the surge in anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia in the aftermath of September 11, 2001 attack, and the conditions of US war and imperialism that followed in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere in the so-called War on Terror. So one of the key tasks of critical Muslim studies is to think across the lived experiences of Muslims globally, to see the patterns of violence, erasure, resistance, and joy. And recognizing the persecution of Muslims in India, the genocide of Rohingya people in Myanmar, the ethnic cleansing of Uyghur people in Xinjiang, and now too the horrific war against Palestinian people in Gaza show the connections of anti-Muslim racism to other forms of nationalist and Orientalist racisms in the United States and the Western world, from anti-Black racism and indigenous genocide, indigenous colonization, to yellow peril anti-Asian racism and white nationalist anti-Semitic violence. Asian Americans have resisted these oppressive patterns through campaigns that negate these harmful discourses with sayings like, "I am not a virus, I am not your wedge, I am not a war, and I am not a terrorist." Critical Muslim studies has an important role to play by asking whose knowledge is being centered when we ask about Muslim life. Right? When we ask whose knowledge is centered, we gain important insights into how different sects, theocratic dictators, refugees, and women's rights are understood. Right? So critical Muslim studies also disrupts the imagined geography of the Muslim world, which is too often too narrowly defined as the Middle East. right? By the same measure, can we ask, is Hartford a part of the Muslim world, right? Critical Muslim studies opens these questions and more to broaden what we know and how we know about Muslim life. So Stuart Hall, a cultural theorist, once wrote that identity is the ability to tell your story in the future. And his formulation makes explicitly the essential work of living and being outside of the binarism of opposition and resistance to racialized violence. So joy and making new meanings through culture and imagining alternative futures where we're thriving together is an important task that must accompany the urgency of ending violence, such as the permanent ceasefire in Gaza. That's why for this first event, we're focusing on poetry from across Muslim societies in struggle and transformation. And so this series is made possible by the AANAPISI grant and the TEAS project at UConn Hartford. It's a federally funded program to address the needs of underserved Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So this 5-year grant supports the introduction of life transformative curriculum, including integration of courses on critical Muslim studies. So this grant recognizes that Asian Americans, and particularly Muslim Americans, many of whom are connected to Asian diasporas, are underserved in our university community, and they too deserve to feel a deep sense of belonging here. And so that's all I want to say, because I need to get out of the way and let Nasim begin to share. And I want to first just ask you, Nasim, to tell us a little bit more about your life and how maybe how does your experience shape the reasons why you value critical Muslim studies?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Chang, for inviting me today. It's an honor to be here. And I just give you a very short introduction of, you introduced me, thank you for that. But I was born and raised in Dashtestan in southern Iran, which is historically known for resistance against colonization and state violence, but also it's the birthplace of some of the most radical poets and freedom fighters in Iran, and that has shaped my cultural and social and political experiences and views. So I left Iran and lived transnationally, as you mentioned, among the diverse culture since I was 20 years old, and that includes living with Muslims from different countries. And so my transnational life that involves living and navigating multiple cultural and social, but also linguistic context has contributed to this, formation of my intersectional identity, or I call it an intersectional identity because I don't consider myself an Iranian anymore because of all these, diverse experiences that draws on elements from different cultural backgrounds. So one of the reasons that I deeply value critical Muslim studies is that it's not disciplinary and it's not traditional field. And in fact, it's an interdisciplinary field that challenges the reductive and essentialist understandings of Muslims and also Islam as a religion through showcasing those complexities of Muslim experiences and identities, but also their cultural practices across different contexts. So I think that this field has the potential to challenge the dominant narratives and stereotypes about Muslims, which are often rooted in Orientalist and Eurocentric discourses and understandings, but also on the other hand are definitely shaped by and because of the crimes of religious fundamentalists in power. And I think this is a very important recognition because it helps to combat those homogenizing understandings of Muslims, which has historically led to their discrimination and marginalizations of Muslims in the world, but also has led to those violent conflicts and to restrictions on Muslims in the world. And there is a need, really, there is a need to understand these structural and systemic factors that contribute to these marginalizations and oppression. Another thing that I think I really appreciate about critical Muslim studies is using the cultural productions that definitely will help the students and will help with diversifying perspectives and promoting intercultural understandings and more importantly, empathy through exposing the learners or the students to different worldviews and values to shape that empathy and understanding for Muslim experiences and see beyond those stereotypes. And especially in the West, and especially in North Americas and in the United States. That will definitely help them in making distinctions between political Islam and Islam as a religion, which can be very transformative, and to recognizing that not all Muslims subscribe to political Islam, that Islam as a religion actually encompasses a wide range of beliefs and practice, and it is crucial to understand this complex relationships between religion and politics in Muslim majority countries, or even in the communities, including the communities in the North Americas. And I give you an example of that is my own country, Iran. So if we take Iran as a sample, we would see that the Iranian government's political Islam cannot represent Muslims in Iran for so many reasons, because Muslims there are really diverse groups with varying interpretations of Islam, and not all Muslims in Iran agree with the government's traditional and patriarchal interpretations of religion or religious texts or their political Islam that is being introduced in post-revolutionary Iran. And for instance, just to give you an example, some Iranians may follow more liberal or mystical interpretations of Islam, like Sufis, while others may be secular or even non-practicing. So we see that even in a country like Iran, we have all these diverse identities and religious beliefs and religious minorities that are constantly engaged in the act of criticizing the government and their gender discriminatory policies and rules that continue to restrict human rights and freedoms. But Muslim and non-Muslim Iranians have challenged and interrogate these policies and interpretations, or they advocate for gender equality and human rights wherever they are, whether they are in Iran or in diaspora. And the majority of them are Muslims, but they are not following the Islam that the religious fanatics have introduced, or they don't even believe in those interpretations of Islam that was introduced after the 1979 revolution. So critical Muslim studies is the right place, I think, to introduce these complexities and paradoxes while also challenging the dominant narratives.
But I just wanted to set the stage that we're going to hear from you reading some poems and giving some background, and then we're going to shift gears and hear some questions from students, and I might interject with a question or two to get us started. But the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'll be reading poems by poets, Muslim poets, and some of them even they don't claim that they are Muslim. Someone like Mahmoud Darwish, nobody knows that he is Muslim or non-Muslim, and he goes beyond like religion, but he writes for Muslim, and he is coming from Palestine. He's a Palestinian. So I'll be reading poems by poets from Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. And I will start with Mahmoud Darwish, Faiz Ahmed Faiz from Pakistan, Fadwa Tuqan, who was a Palestinian feminist poet, and then Chairil Anwar from Indonesia. So the first poem is Who Am I Without Exile, which is translated by Fadi Judah. A stranger on the riverbank, like the river, water binds me to your name. Nothing brings me back from my far away to my palm tree, not peace and not war. Nothing makes me enter the Gospels, not a thing. Nothing sparkles from the shore of ebb and flow between the Euphrates and the Nile. Nothing makes me descend from the Pharaoh's boats. Nothing carries me or makes me carry an idea. Not longing and not promise. What will I do? What will I do without exile and a long night that stares at the water? Water binds me to your name. Nothing takes me from the butterflies of my dreams to my reality. Not dust and not fire. What will I do without roses from Samarkand? What will I do in a theater that burnishes the singers with its lunar stones? Our way has become light like our houses in the faraway winds. We have become two friends of the strange creatures in the clouds, and we are now loosened from the gravity of identity's land. What will we do? What will we do without exile and the long night that stares at the water? Water binds me to your name. There's nothing left of me but you, and nothing left of you but me. The stranger messaging his stranger's tie. Oh, stranger, what will we do with what is left to us of calm and of a snooze between two myths? And nothing carries us, not the road and not the house. Was this road always like this from the start? Or did our dreams find the mare on the hill among the Mongol horses and exchange us for it? And what will we do? What will we do without exile? The next poem is by Faiz Ahmed Faiz, and it's called Speak Out. Speak out, your words are free. Speak up, your tongue is still your own. Your body remains yours, brown broad, erect. Speak out, your life is still your own. Look, how in your smith's forge flames soar, iron glows red, how the locks have open yaws and every chain unlinked now spreads. The short time left to you is still enough. Speak up before the body and its tongue give out. Speak out, for truth still survives. Speak out, say whatever you have to say. Next poem is by Fadwa Tuqan, and it's translated into English by Michael R. Birch. Tonight the wind wafts pollen through ruined fields and homes. The earth shivers with love, with the agony of giving birth. While the invaders spread stories of submission and surrender, oh Arab Aurora, tell the usurper childbird's a force beyond his ken. Because a mother's racked body reveals a rent that inaugurates life, a crack through which light dawns in an instant, as the blood's rose blooms in the wound. And the next and the last poet is Chairil Anwar from Indonesia. The poem is called Me. When my time comes, no one's going to cry for me, and you won't either. The hell with all those tears. I'm a wild beast, driven out of the herd. Bullets may pierce my skin, but I'll keep coming, carrying forward my wounds and my pain, attacking until suffering disappears. And I won't give a damn. I want to live another 1,000 years.
That was such a lovely reading. Thank you, Nasim. I want to start maybe with a couple questions that I think might connect across the poems that you read. And they don't have to be answered in order, but I'll just put them out there and then we can see kind of how they connect. So the first thing is, just what things stood out for you in those poems, and then also, what do these poems tell us about being Muslim in the world? And then also, I think the last one that I'm kind of most interested in is what futures do these authors inspire us to imagine? And, anyone can answer, but those were, such beautiful poems. I was taking notes as you were writing. But maybe Nasim, would you like to start with a response, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think well, these poems, they all, and not just these poems, but all the poems of these authors, their poems in general give us a sense of agency and purpose, and try to make us feel more hopeful about our abilities to make a difference through our words and also through our actions. Because all these poets, they were revolutionaries and activists beside being a poet. So they inspire us to be more resilient and to keep going, and even when things are tough. So they evoke a sense of wonder and also possibility. For example, poets like Fadwa Tuqan or Mahmoud Darwish, who are both Palestinians, they have had a profound influence on the people of the Middle East, and not just Palestine, and also globally, and especially in terms of resistance and identity. They try to introduce those marginalized identities that we don't get to see them in the media or in the news. And their works really resonate with many Middle Easterners who seek to assert their cultural and political autonomy in the face of colonialism and foreign interventions. But also they resist the internal oppressions at the same time. For instance, Mahmoud Darwish was a serious critic of Hamas and his brutalities in Palestine, but also other authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. And Tuqan's poetry at the same time is like a double-edged sword, and is characterized by its feminist perspectives and this exploration of Palestinian identity and resistance, which speaks a lot to the experiences of Palestinian women and all Middle Eastern women and their role in the struggle for national liberation. But also at the same time and simultaneously, Tuqan's poetry is a voice for Palestinian and Middle Eastern women against the patriarchy that is being buried through and by the global apartheid, and then again by the state violence, and the male-dominated society's unequal and oppressive treatment of women in the Arab world. but also in Iran, we're being so much influenced by Mahmoud Darwish, by poets like Mahmoud Darwish, by Tuqan, by poets from Southeast Asia, like Iqbal, Muhammad Iqbal, and also by Faiz, Ahmed Faiz, and many others. So there are these intercultural and literary resistance movements that are very connected in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and goes all the way to the United States. And we know that many Iranians and Middle Eastern poets, including Mahmoud Darwish, was really influenced by American literature, by Allen Ginsberg, for example. So they also help us to understand what does it mean to experience displacement, exile, and the struggle for freedom. What does it mean for all these Muslim identities? But also their poetry, or through their poetry, they try to challenge the simplistic and monolithic portrayals of the Muslims, but through exploring the many different ways in which people identify as Muslim and the diverse and cultural and historical influences that shape these identities of Muslims and non-Muslim population in their lands, in those geographies. And also they challenge the assumptions that all Muslims share the same beliefs and cultural norms. They also remind us that it's true, it's a reality that being Muslim, just like being a Jew in the world, can be incredibly challenging and even devastating for many people. And they often face discrimination and violence because of their religion and because of the geographies that they come from, and may be targeted by hate crimes or surveillance and other forms of state violence. But all of them bring hope through their poetry and try to, provide us with some alternative realities and some patterns of violence, show us how to resist oppression, and they to understand the importance of radical imagination to create new worlds. So they inspire us to imagine a variety of alternative futures, depending on the specific context and the struggle they are engaged in. So, for instance, some of them write about the struggle against colonialism and imperialism, and imagine futures where Muslim communities are free from foreign domination and are able to self-determine their own political and cultural futures. But they also imagine futures where social justice and equality are realized, particularly for marginalized communities, and also the rights of women and religious and ethnic minorities. So they are very inclusive in their approaches to social justice. And it's very interesting about the Muslim world, and especially the Middle East, where I come from, and I know I studied the movements there. These poets and their works have historically shaped the futures, including these specific poets that I read their poetry here. So, because literature is a part of our daily life there in the Middle East, and for centuries and for thousands of years, poets have always shown that they have the capacity to bring communities together, to unite them for transformation and also for healing from historical traumas and injustices. And also, if you just look at the contemporary or even ancient history of the Middle East, you see that history would tell us that poets are behind all social and cultural transformations and revolutions. And a great example of that would be the recent Iran's feminist movement in 22, which is also known as Women Life Freedom Revolution, that was unfortunately hijacked by the mainstream opposition groups, even though it came from the underground and from the depth of the Iranian society, and also by the Iranian regime's suppression and uses of violence against the protesters and the dissent. But it was poetry and arts of underground Iran that shaped this revolution. So they create and introduce alternative futures where harmony and peace dominate instead of hate and violence, and despite all the challenges of human condition. I hope others also have answers to these questions.
Yeah, I was while you were reading, I think these poems are very beautiful, and I think there's one very strong similarity between all three of them, where there's a sense of urgency, and not urgency for even like, I feel like in these situations you were, or not even situations, but with this language you would hear like urgency as in help, what can we do, whatever. But I think the way that these poems were structured, it was like, we're here and we will stay, and it's just, there's a sense of resilience and urgency, really just to look, just to be seen, you know. And I think it was just very beautiful how all three was very different too. It wasn't even that they had the same way of communicating it, but they had the same way of they had the same idea, you know, and it was very beautiful.
Yeah, good. I just wanted to say that I kind of wanted to agree with Sharah and say that they were all very different, but they all just showed the same idea that to be Muslim, you have to have this sense of firmness and you have to just show yourself and be yourself fully to be able to like make a change. It's like all of them are talking about there's going to be another side that's going to be full of everything that we pray and hope for of freedom, but until then we have to show ourselves and we have to just show up and show out every single situation that we can, but in a beautiful way, not in a aggression, not in stern, not in it's my way or no way, but in like this is just who I am.
And I thought it was really interesting that you did bring up the fact that throughout every revolution or any change there is poetry and language behind it. I think that's so true, and it's something that's really, I think, even if we look into, I'm going to get a little Islamic here, guys, but I think when we look at Islam, there's a emphasis on how you should hold yourself as a Muslim, and there's this thing with carry yourself with dignity and make sure you're, you know, spreading ideas of peace, and you're standing where you are and you're resilient and you're able to show out and be there as a Muslim, you know. And I think with, you know, talks of like changes and revolution and poetry being part of it, um being around this like Islamic culture, I think it shapes you to have language that's gentle and but not compromising, and it's, you know, you're expressive in how you talk because this is just how the culture is and was and hopefully will be, you know.
Khadija, would you like to offer any thoughts?
I agree with everything they said. I was just thinking that the common theme behind the poetry is kind of struggle and revolution, and they were all going through like, or their people, the countries were going through a hard time, and their poetry really shows through with it. Especially, I think Mahmoud Darwish, his a lot of his poetry is really inspired by the Palestinian struggle, and maybe it would have been different if he wasn't Palestinian, but his a lot of his poetry really comes up and shows that he has gone through a lot. And I think it was the same with the Indonesian poet too, where the background really is about the Indonesians being colonized, and it's the same with Ahmed Faiz too, where in South Asia they were really going through a lot of political struggle, and there as a South Asian, like we can both probably agree on this, that a lot of our revolutions and the wars that our countries have gone through, a lot of it was seen over by, in a way, by poets. It was very inspired by them. It was kind of, the revolutions were led by them too, especially Allama Iqbal. So yeah, I just think it's a common theme behind all of this.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just give you a comment. You know, Darwish's poetry is very universal. So he did not just, for sure, his experiences of displacement and violence and occupation shaped the way he perceived the world and also shaped his poetry and poetic trajectories. But also he wrote for the Jews as well. So he's known as the poet of peace. That means that he always invited or Jews, Muslims, Christians, and other religious minorities to come together and to make peace in the Middle East, and particularly in Israel and Palestine. So it's but the violence definitely moved him and moved his poetry, you know, towards these trajectories and these, you know, thoughts. So he always tried to make a revolution. So he was a revolutionary, and he tried to make a revolution not just in Israeli consciousness, but also in the Palestinian consciousness. And he was a little bit feminist as well.
Yeah, thank you, y'all. I want to invite Professor Julie Schofel to comment. As a poet herself, someone who teaches creative writing here at UConn Hartford, and has many years worked with students in this in creative writing. I wonder if you have any thoughts from the conversation or from, you know, listening to things reading of these four poets.
Hi, thank you. Yes, that was just wonderful, Nasim, hearing you read those, all of those poems. I'm thinking about so many different things now, after hearing those. And it makes me think about how poetry is so interesting in that it uses language to try to transcend the trappings of language, right? And I see all of these poems kind of working with similar ideas of how do we transcend the story but stay in the story? How do we transcend the fight but stay with the fight? You know, there's these like themes that you already mentioned of resilience, and it feels like, you know, in the poem Speak, right? There's this repetition of speaking despite everything, and this emphasis on long time. It says, speak this brief hours long enough before the death of body and tongue. Speak because the truth is not dead yet, whatever you must speak. And there's so many lines that were similar in some of the other poems too, that felt like a reference to the experience being bigger than the individual experience, and also the individual being, you know, having a bigger experience than just, you know, just this one thing, right? This event or this experience of oppression and trauma and war. They're huge. They're all encompassing, and yet in all of the poems it also feels like there's this emphasis on like, but also we are more than this, right? And also an individual is more than this, the people is more than this. And I was just really curious about your thoughts about the Darwish poem, and especially that repetition that's in the title and that ends the poem, "What will we do without exile?" I think that's just such an interesting idea. You mentioned paradox earlier, and I was thinking about like whether you hear some irony and paradox in that question that comes through in that poem. Because I hear it as, I mean, you know, so many things in this poem are about like identity, right? He mentions our names and things about places that he has come from and that others come from. But then he says, what will we do without exile? Almost like, like one could be defined by one's exile, right? And yet there's also so much luscious detail from nature and other things in this poem, right? That make me think about that question in different ways, like, how we are larger, right, than just our exile. And yet, I don't know, I'm just curious to hear your opinion on that part of the poem, because I feel like it's doing so many things, and it's such um, a beautiful poem with the repetition of water, and there's so much, to think about there. But I was especially kind of taken with those lines and those last lines and what you think of them.
Well, thank you so much. It's a good and complex question, so I hope I can answer that. But again, coming from these Iranian communities, poetic communities, I can tell you that we always think and we always believe that humans are much more than what we think, and especially if they are poets and artists. So it's something that anthropology needs to discover. Um, but also our Sufi poets always say that, we are much more than humans. We are the universe in so many ways. Like Rumi famously says that. But you talk about Dervish's poetry, it's definitely full of paradoxes that reflect the complexities and contradictions of the Palestinian experiences, and especially the experience of exile, which you mentioned, and longing for going back home for a return. But I have this experience of being friend and working with lots of Palestinian poets, and I know that it's the same concern for all of them. And then all of them in their work, they just write about the pain and about the disorientation of exile. And also, but at the same time, exile can be a source of fostering creativity and insight, and giving them allowing them for a deeper understanding of their own identity and also the mysteries of the universe. And we have a lot of these poets and writers in exile, and we see them that even though they were forced and they were displaced to leave Iran, just like Mahmoud Darwish or other poets who had to live a diasporic life in exile, we see that they always express a deep longing for return to their countries, but again, at the same time, it's very difficult for them to go back. I mean, they're now used to these new worlds that they have created for them, especially if you're a poet, you're always engaged in the act of building and creating new physical and mental and also intellectual worlds. So they want to go back, but at the same time, they've created a totally new world that is transformative in so many ways for the new communities and their host countries. But Dervish's poetry always celebrates this resilience and resistance of people, and also he has always tried to acknowledge that resistance through his poetry, and always suggest that even the identities, the diverse identities of Palestinians, which is not only one identity, it's diverse, is both rooted in the land and in their culture, but also it's constantly evolving thing and adapting in response to the changing circumstances. So I hope I could answer this question. And then at the end, after living a diasporic life in exile, they end up having, or possessing a new identity which is intersectional. And I talked about it, like about my own experiences as a person with an intersectional identity, which is shaped by all these, cultural, political, and social experiences.
Thank you, Professor Schofel, for the question. That was really just a wonderful dive into the text and into these, the cultural process of imagining and how useful paradox is for doing that. I'm also reflecting on the ways that artists and poets have always been central to the Asian American movement. And one of the things that historians of the Asian American movement point out is that it's artists and poets that that help us to imagine the thing that's just out of reach, that does not exist quite yet. And that by articulating it, by either through imagery or through words, that we're able to orient ourselves to that action, to something that doesn't quite exist yet, or that that may never exist, but is that that worthy pursuit. And one of the things I wanted to draw attention to in this program is the way that poetry is deeply embedded in Muslim cultures across the world. For instance, at UConn, we have a specific program on Qazi Nazrul Islam, who's the national poet of Bangladesh, and that we know that Nazrul's poetry is taught in primary schools and is taught in many different places. It's a part of public life, and so I wanted to invite you, Sharah, and Farah, Khadija, just to reflect with us. What ways do you find poetry from your community, from your diaspora, from your family? How does poetry circulate in your world?
I'm Pakistani, so usually most of our poetry that is usually used in conversations and at home too is by Allama Iqbal, and I think it has a lot to do with the education system there, where our parents who grew up there, they have been taught and they've had to analyze these poets, Allama Iqbal, Faiz, and I forget that there's another one too, and they're the deep meaning of what they wanted to say, what was their thought process and everything. So it has become a part of our culture where a lot of times, even in daily life, to express something, they may use poetry to tell us, like, in code, like, this is what I want you to do. So I think culturally, like, and back then too, during 1947, the partition, I think that influenced a lot of our culture because Allama Iqbal was actually the one at um, the front of the separation movement, where he wanted a separate Muslim state for the Muslims, and a lot of people say that he had seen the vision that if we don't have a separate Muslim state, that Muslims would go through a great suffering, like in India right now. So I think that really influenced it, and people really admire him, and he is everywhere, and he has books after him, and he's just become part of the culture, and that's something that it's become like a common. It can be a discussion topic too with a lot of the adults that actually have studied his poetry and have read his books. But you.
Yeah, I think with the partition, like the war that came from that whole Pakistan Bangladesh thing, I think it really did a number on the poetry and how it's embedded into our homes. I think like my parents, I grew up with my dad writing poetry all the time and my mom like writing music and writing songs and all these things. And We even communicate the same thing that she said. We communicate sometimes in just full on poetic code. When she's mad, she says stuff like, "Oh my God, my head is flooding with so many thoughts." Flooding. Anyways, it's just a whole bunch of all these things, and it's like it's more than just a way to move things, but it's just how we act now. And I think it's really good, even if we take it to like a domestic idea. Back when like I first put on my hijab, and there was a whole bunch of things going on, because the Islam at home is very different from Islam that is Islam. So me putting on the hijab was like a revolutionary thing in my home. So there were a lot of talks about it, and the only way that we could really come to an understanding of what the hijab really is, or what Islam really means to me or means to us as a family, it was communicated through, gentle talks and resilience. I feel that resilience keeps coming up, but I feel that this is what really pushes it. And I think that language, and that even that poetry that came from just us arguing back and forth about, what are the new changes, what are we going to get used to now, what am I trying to do with my hijab and my belief in Islam and how I'm thinking now. It all comes from, that language change, that language shift that we all had to have in the home. And I think it, back to the whole partition thing, I think it really comes from like the push from there, where yeah.
And to add on to that, I think it just came to me that a lot of our music, Sufi music, is very popular in Pakistan, and Qawwali is a form of Sufi music, you could say. And that is inspired by a lot of poets. And sometimes the musician will add on to their own poetry, but it is very poetic. And it's become part of the culture to have a poetry night before someone gets married, or just to celebrate something big, where they invite these musicians to sing that it doesn't sound like music that we listen to, like pop music. It's very different. It's very um kind of like connecting to the soul and very deep, and you have to think about what they're actually saying. And a lot of it is also religious, where poetry has become another way to connect to Allah, to connect to God. And you could really sit down and think about the way God is described through poetry. And especially even in Pakistan, even the language itself, Urdu, is inspired by poetry. So the language itself is very poetic, and a lot of the words come from, they're newly added on to after the separation of Pakistan and India. They've been added on to because of these poets and all that they promoted during that time.
Yeah. And language is a big thing too, because for Bangladesh, our whole reason to be independent and to be so pushing for the movement to have independence was because we were losing our language. Um, so it's very important, which is why it's so important in my house to keep, Bangla going and be able to talk fluently and have everything flow. It's very important in my home, because that was once on the line, and we were very close to, not really having that. It was just so recent too. I feel like it sounds like it's years ago. This was just like 60, 70 years ago. Yeah.
I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to excuse myself because I have somewhere to be right now. But it was so nice.
Thank you, Farah, for joining us.
Of course. I enjoyed it.
Khadija, Sharah, this was just tremendous. Thank you so much for joining this conversation and sharing your experiences and your thoughts. Thank you, Professor Basiri. Thank you, Professor Schofel. This was such a wonderful way to start this work. For those who will be watching, stay tuned for the next episode. We're going to bring in other faculty, other experts in the field to join us in conversation. And really, this is also an introduction to or kind of an opening, an invitation for students to look for a new course, AAAS 2020 Introduction to Critical Muslim Studies. We're going to be offering this for the first time in Hartford, at UConn Hartford, in the fall. So we're looking forward to having that course and bringing these kinds of questions to the classroom. So this is just, I am just filled with gratitude, and very excited for this program to be off the ground and for y'all's participation. So yes, thank you again, and and would anyone like to add any parting words?
Well, thank you so much, Professor Chang and Professor Schoffel and Farah and Khadija and Sharah, everyone. It was very engaging and fruitful conversation. I hope we can continue it the future.
Really grateful that we were here. Thank you so much. This was very nice.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Good afternoon, y'all. Take care.